All right. Well, welcome to Sub to Investor. I want to welcome back Bill Walston to the show here. Welcome, Bill.
Hi, Hans. Thanks for having me back again.
Lots of good feedback from that interview that we did over tax strategy. And so I wanted to have
That's
you
great.
back. Absolutely. Wanted to have you back because not only are you a tax expert, but you are a master of lease and options and creative finance. So I want to have you back to discuss lease and options in particular
Sure.
and master lease options. So why don't we begin with, why don't you share just a little bit about your experience on the real estate side and creative finance, lease and option side of things? How did you get started doing lease and options?
Oh, okay. Well, I started, probably started off with sub two deals and stuff like that years and years ago, like over 40. And so I've been doing these a while. And I have that hierarchy of how I like to approach a deal on the acquisition side, right? So I will start with sub two, move on to wraps and second mortgages, then on to contracts for deed, and then finally a lease option. That's on the acquisition side. But as you know, on the distribution side or on my exit strategy side, I actually start with lease and option. So when I started them, I kind of was more on the sales side, right? So I would have been the optionor, not the optionee. Okay. But then, going and depending on what the market is, sometimes your best acquisition strategy might be a lease and option deal. So I'm not opposed to using that as an acquisition in order to keep a good deal, right? So it just depends on the market sometimes. Also, like lease and options for some of my clients when they're first getting started and they're saying, okay, Bill, I don't know much about this. I'm trying to find my way on it. What is the least risky type of structure that I can get into? And guys, I fall back on a lease and option deal because that has the lowest risk, okay, for you as an investor, the middleman, okay, because it's very difficult to lose on those. Might a deal get screwed up, right? And something happened and your tenant buyer not perform like they should. Well, if that's the case, you just turn around and you say to your seller, right? Say, dude, this is what's happening. I need out of my lease. And, the worst case scenario is you pay a little bit to break your lease type thing. So that's why I look at it as being one of the least risky strategies if you've got somebody who doesn't know a whole lot about what they're doing, right? And they're afraid they might mess up. It's very difficult to mess up a lease option deal. Okay, there are a lot of gurus out there who say, "Oh no, that's the worst type of deal you can do." But I've been very successful with them, and especially for high-end properties as well, right? Because I have done what I call executive lease purchases, right, on some very high-end properties, and it's a good way to control without ownership, right? And that's one of the best things that you can do. And somebody told me one time, say, Bill, you like this control without ownership, but if you're doing a sub two deal or something like that, you actually own the property. So you control the property, but you're controlling it with ownership. So if you really want to control without ownership, that's what lease option deals kind of fall right into. The other thing I like, pardon?
Can I butt in here real quick? You're saying
absolutely.
So much good stuff. I just want to make sure that the audience, I don't want to stop your train of thought here, but I kind of want to anyways, because there's three things you said that I just kind of want to try and hit those real quick. So you said that on your acquisition strategy, lease and option, like you have a hierarchy. And this would be good just to recap here, because I think on the previous interview, you talked about this as well. And I'm in full accord with you on this. From my perspective, it totally makes sense to me. But your hierarchy of when you go to buy, lease and option is actually the lowest priority. It's the least preferable usually. And at the top, you're getting the deed subject to or seller finance, maybe a land contract in there, like a contract for deed. And then like a lease and option would be less preferable. But why is it less preferable on the acquisition side usually?
Because you don't have ownership. Okay. You don't have the
Right.
ownership of the property. And when you own the property or you have the deed in hand and your name is on that deed, that is the greatest control you can have over the property.
Right. Okay. So then
Okay.
let's backpedal to why would you want to? Because you mentioned market conditions. I'm curious what you mean by sometimes with certain market conditions or certain situation, it might be preferable to actually do that lease and option, which is why it's good to have in your tool belt. So, in what circumstance does it make sense to come in and do?
Well, okay. So it really would depend on the rise and fall of the market back in 20, I guess maybe it's like 2018 or something like that, when there was a whole mess of going on. Properties were underwater. Okay. And, sometimes you'd have a property, it would be up, turn around 2 or 3 days later, the price would have fallen out of that and the market would have gone down. And those overinflated prices that the market was giving us. And back in those days, that's the market was overinflated. We all know that. The higher values were illusory, right? They really weren't there. It was just there because of people buying and kind of like the supply and demand. So if you're in a market where there is a very good possibility that market prices might decline, okay, if you own the property, there goes your equity and there goes a lot of other things if that's the case, right?
Interesting.
So I'm not saying it is always the best acquisition strategy, but it is a viable acquisition strategy. And
Yeah,
and of
for
course,
sure.
my acquisition strategy has evolved since I'm more familiar with how the deeds work and how to paper my deal and those types of things. So sometimes when I'm working with a client and you kind of, and this, you're kind of getting into that side where you're looking and dealing with people and trying to teach them how to use the deal strategies and things like that. Sometimes it's better to start them on a deal strategy where the risk is less to them, right? And that they can't get out there and hurt themselves, because a lot of the ways that we learn is by actually doing.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
it's when they're out there doing, you've got baby steps. So you might say, hey, look, why don't you try some of these strategies first, see how it works out with you, right? And then you can kind of go from there. So that's why I
Yes.
like it. Sometimes also it's a matter of how quickly you need to control the property. Because I'll tell you, you can close a lease and option deal sometimes a lot faster than you can close the negotiation of the deed and the title work and all this kind of stuff. Basically, it's hey, let me get in there, get this settled, because that's how one of my Nashville deals went. Right, I was working with a client who was wanting to move from Colorado. They were moving to Nashville, okay, because of job change. Right. I knew that they did not want to get into a house immediately because they didn't know where in Nashville. That's a pretty big place. And there are certain areas you want to not be in Nashville, like Franklin and some of these outlying areas in that is considered Nashville, but it's better areas to live in, stuff like that. I think some of this came from the wife on his side saying, hey, I don't know where we want to live when we get there, but we got to have somewhere to live in. Right. So essentially what we ended up doing with him was putting him into a lease and option deal, right? And that way they would have time to decide where they wanted to live, if that's what they really wanted to do. I didn't have a property that I owned in Nashville at that particular time. So I said, heck, I'll just go in and I will, I'll do a lease option. I'll buy on a lease option. We'll do a sandwich lease option deal. And that was the quickest way to do it. And I'm not going to turn away and walk away from my client by trying to spend a lot of time negotiating and all this kind of stuff. Because the time that you have during your lease period, okay, can cover a lot of things. I mean, it can make up for a lack of time to do the due diligence that you want to do and stuff like that. Because remember, if you're in a lease, okay, and you have the option to buy, if you find something during the time that you're within that lease period, you don't have to exercise your option. So if we found out this property was no good, we could just walk away from it after that option period.
Totally. Yeah, no, that's all totally makes sense and is really elucidating for investors wondering when would I want to buy on a lease option or acquire on a lease option. Uh, like you're saying, speed. If you
Mhm.
need to get a deal done quickly, you can usually get that done a lot faster than having to go through a
Absolutely.
title
All you got to
search.
do is, all you got to do is sign a lease and option. You don't have to go to the courts. You don't have to have a closing. You don't have to do any of that. So it saves a lot of time.
Right. Less risk in a down market where values could be decreasing in the foreseeable future. That totally makes sense as well. And I think there's certain markets right now where that is happening.
Mhm.
Houses are
Not
sitting.
many, but not many, and not like in the 2018 time period, but it is happening in some cases.
Right. Okay. So when you're when you're acquiring on lease option, let's talk about that for a minute and how you like what terms and what paper I mean, it's so what's the so first of all, talk about what paper you use for acquiring on a lease option, and then if you could also touch on, you mentioned executory or executive lease option, and I know I don't really know much about master lease option. So if you can talk about like on when you're acquiring property that way, what does the paperwork look like? What's the basic paper we're talking
Yeah,
about?
what I love about it, paperwork is so simple. So rental agreement and an option to purchase. That's it. Okay, that's now you can come up with other things that you might want to have in there, like assignment forms, and there's certain documents that you have to maybe have later on, depending on what's going on within the lease. Okay, but the basic paper that you need for a lease and option deal is a lease and an option. That's it, right? So essentially, you find a property and you negotiate with the owner of that property to, hey, I want to rent the property and then buy it from you later down the road. Okay. And to do that, you say, how much am I going to pay you a month? That's the rental agreement. And then how much am I going to pay you when I exercise my option? In other words, what is the property going to cost me? And that's your option price or your strike price. And that's the amount that you're going to owe. And then there are all kinds of shenanigans that can go in between there as to, okay, if I'm going to be paying you this much every month, I want X amount to go towards the purchase price. So that's negotiable. But it's still all within that document, or those two documents, rather.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
As far as master lease, okay, any lease that you have where you control the property with the right to sublet, meaning that you can have a lease underneath your lease,
Mhm.
then the lease that you have with the owner of the property is called a master lease.
Got it. So
Believe it or not.
it's that simple.
Yeah, it's that simple. That is a master lease. In fact, David Tilney, okay, most people don't hear a lot about him because he is strictly a lease guy. Okay, he does nothing but lease properties and sublease them. So he's not even leasing them with an option to buy. He is leasing them with the right to sublet. And that's what he does. That's how, for years and years, that's all he did was, hey, I'm going to lease it at this price. I'm going to sublet it at this price. I'm keeping the difference. So he was going into it just for cash flow. He wasn't going into it for acquisition of properties or anything like that. Okay. And then a lot of people, and I certainly wasn't the first, I think I was one who did it maybe the best, actually acquired multifamily properties using this same strategy, where you lease the property from the owners of the property with the right to sublet all of the individual units. Okay,
Right.
so when most people hear master lease option, they think multifamily, where you're making you have all these different units and you're outsourcing them, right, or subletting them. But actually, a master lease option is anytime you control a lease with the right to sublet.
I got it. So the document, the master lease, we'll call it, doesn't have the word master lease at the top. It might just have
No.
the word lease agreement. And
Yeah.
then there's a section that has right to sublease. and effectively that's a master lease.
That effectively is a master lease.
Very helpful.
Yep.
Yeah, makes sense that we don't hear about it as much in the single family space than if it was,
Hardly
maybe
ever. Yeah, you
or
hardly
in
ever.
the
In fact, usually if you are leasing with the right to sublet in a single family residence type deal, most of the time you hear that referred to as a sandwich lease, right? Because I'm
Yep,
sure most
we've
people
heard
have
that.
heard of a sandwich lease option. And the reason they
Yep.
call it the sandwich is you're the meat in the middle, so to speak, right? You're the go-between, you're the middleman, you're the investor in that type of deal.
Yeah, and this has been that's been a popular strategy for short-term rental investors, right? I mean,
Gosh,
they've
it's been a strategy.
essentially,
Yeah, and that's why I always get amused when people talk about their new strategy that involves a residential lease and an option, right? Which just leads to my theory that I've had for years and years. There's not much new in real estate. You can always find somebody who's been doing this like years ago.
right. Yep. Yep.
I mean, you would think that there are a few people out there, and you would think that they invented short-term rentals, and short-term rentals have been around for ages. We just didn't call them short-term rentals.
Thing with subject to, right?
And there was no, oh yeah, same thing with subject to. That's the strategy that people were doing. Lord, I know they've been doing it at least 4 decades because I've been doing it that long. Subject to deals, right?
Yeah, yeah. So, with the option fee, let's get back to that lease option when you're acquiring, whether
Sure.
it just be an option, just a standard option to purchase contract, or maybe the lease. It's probably going to be, if you're acquiring it, it's going to be a master lease of some kind. You're likely not going to do an option to purchase contract unless you're wholesaling it or something. Then there won't be a lease. But let's just assume that your plan is to cash flow on the property. And we've been dancing around this, but just to state this clearly, when you're doing a master lease or a sandwich lease option, you don't have the tax benefits. You don't have um, you're not deducting mortgage interest, all that kind of stuff. I'd assume I'm correct, right?
Well, believe it or not, there are a lot of tax benefits to doing lease option deals. Okay.
Okay.
So
Well, I like to hear
yes.
about that.
All right. So yes. Well, if you got another question before we get into those, then I will take that question. But I would.
Yeah,
continue with you.
maybe let's hold on that for 1 second.
Sure.
So, and you can correct me on that. But my question was about the option fee. So when we sell on a lease and option, or should we say, I don't know if that's even the right terminology, we rent to own on a lease and option, then we're collecting usually an option fee. But when we're acquiring on a lease and option, what do you put down any option fee? Do you have a
You
valid?
know me, I'm not putting out any money if I don't have to. All right. So here's what's nice about it. The option fee is what you and the owner of the property, and I'm talking about if I'm acquiring using lease and option. The option fee is what you and the owner of the property negotiate. And Bill negotiates very, very low option fee. I don't put up option fees. If I am doing a lease and option deal, okay, I negotiate the rent with the seller. Okay. And then usually my option fee is $10 and other good and valuable consideration. I don't put down an option fee. He's getting his rent, right? He probably gets first and last, or first and a security deposit, just like any other lease. And that's what I tell him. And if he comes to me and asks for an option fee, I said, dude, why do you need an option fee? You got rent, you're getting monthly rent, so you're getting paid. So you're in the same position that you're in when I came along. It's just that you're giving me the right to buy the property.
Right. Yep.
Right.
And they probably wouldn't even know what option fee is unless they sought out an attorney or something like that. So yeah.
Yep. Correct.
Got it.
So and Well, that's something I'll throw in later. But yeah, if I am the man in the middle, I do not pay an option fee, or I pay as little as possible for my option fee. Usually it is just the $10 and other good and valuable consideration. When I was doing master lease options in the heyday, back when I was really, really doing a lot of them, I think I paid $500 one time for a option fee, and I never did that again because I realized after the deal closed, I could have gotten away with not paying it. And so he says, well, do you think that's fair to your seller? Sure, I do. I think it's fair to the seller because he's getting his rent. Okay. And he has the capacity to collect X amount of dollars. His strike price, okay, whatever it may be, whether it goes up or whether the market goes up or goes down, he gets what that option agreement says is the strike price.
Right. Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. There's when you're conducting a sale, like a subject to sale or seller financing, seller carryback, there's often this expectation. Most sellers want something at closing for their equity for the house, and so you're usually bringing some form of cash nowadays. At least I don't know what it was like 10 or 20 years ago, but on this lease and option acquisition strategy, it just appears to me that there's more potential to get some upfront cash from an optionee on the backside when you go and then you sandwich it and you wrap the option because there's usually going to be nothing upfront besides the lease payment to your seller, and then you can collect 3 to 5, maybe up to 7% on an option fee.
Absolutely. Yep.
So that's interesting. And I got a lot of questions. Like the tax, how is that option fee? So let's turn to the when we disposition or sell properties on a lease and option, we're trying to collect a option fee from our tenant buyer.
So we already either own the property, or because remember, disposition, you can get rid of one of your own properties that you own, right, with a lease and option as well. So let's say that we're doing the sandwich lease option. We've already got our deal with the seller, right? So now what we do is we go out and we find a tenant optionee, okay, which basically is someone who wants to pay me on a lease agreement, right? And then wants to have the right to buy the property from me. That's what we're assuming right now. Okay. So your question is?
Yeah, thanks for setting that up. My question is, what kind of option fee are we typically gunning for, or do you typically gun for? What's the lowest? What's the highest in terms of percentage of that option to buy price that we set out in the contract?
You already mentioned like 3 to 5%
Mm-hmm.
as an option fee. Generally, I will keep my option fee to my tenant optionee, right? I will keep it within the 3 to 5% range because that's what's typical of an option fee on a purchase, right? On an option to buy. Now, years ago, people would get 10%, 20%, right? I know people today who will get 20%, 15%, 10%, and call it an option fee. Okay. If they ever got audited, or if the seller did, or if your tenant optionee did not perform and decided they wanted to go and sue you to get all the money that they have paid you back. Okay. Anybody looking at a 10% or more fee, I think a judge, and I know the Internal Revenue Service, are going to look at that and say, this was not a lease and option agreement. This is a disguised sale, and we're going to treat it as a sale as of the day that the agreement was entered into, which means that IRS would go back and reclassify all the monies that you got as payments. They would tax you on the gain on the sale, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Also, a judge would probably say, "Yep, this was a sale gone wrong, and so you owe all the money back to your tenant person, so to speak." Right?
Yeah.
That's the downside to getting a very large option fee up front. Okay. Now, of
Mhm.
course, I will tell you, just like I tell people about tax stuff, it's a moot point if you don't ever get audited. It's a moot point if you never get taken to court. Right. So if you want to err on the side of knowing that it might be reclassified as a disguised sale, but you think the risk is so low that you won't do it, you go ahead and charge whatever you want to. What I'm saying, though, is the typical agreement I like to see is between 3 to 5%. Sometimes
Yep.
7, like you said.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a good point that you just bring in the element of risk, and an investor might be comfortable with taking that risk.
Absolutely. I have
And
clients
so
who are totally willing to take that risk. And I
and
say,
that's their
fine.
business model.
I have no problem with that. You just need to be aware of this is what might happen. And I explain it to my clients that, hey, this is the risk that you're running, and they say, I don't care. Fine. Whatever you negotiate with your tenant optionee is what you negotiate. And if they're willing to put down 10%, 15%, take it.
So just to clarify, we're talking about equitable interest. So when you're saying, this could be perceived as a disguised sale by the Internal Revenue Service, and then they would come in, they would reclassify that option payment as actual, like, a gain, or a gain
Well, they would classify it as a down payment
down
on a
payment.
sale. And they would go back and probably go back the way I've seen it done in the past, or alluded to when I've been talking to IRS auditors and stuff like that, is they would reclassify it as an installment sale.
So if we collect a large option fee, I know we were talking about this earlier about if you're crediting a portion of the rent, like so there's a lot here that we're to unpack, but
To
because
unpack, yeah.
some rent to owns, it's there's no portion of the monthly payment of the lease payment is going toward that option fee. Sometimes it does, or it can if you structure it that way. Um, so talk for a minute about equitable interest and when we're
Okay.
dispositioning on lease and option.
So if you are doing a reasonable option fee and stuff like that, generally there is no equitable interest, because a lot of people have the mistaken impression that an option grants them equitable interest. It does not. Okay. A purchase and sale agreement will, in some states, grant you equitable interest, but not in all states. I don't know of any state where an option agreement grants you equitable interest. Option agreement gives you nothing but the right to purchase. Okay, and since there is no obligation, okay, then there is no equitable interest.
And why is that significant for the investor?
So the significance for the investor is if you are selling the property and the client has no equitable interest, they can't come back and claim the sale. They can't say that they were buying it. They can't come back and say, this didn't go through, so you owe me this money back, because there is no equitable interest. Is
Okay.
how it's been, conveyed to me through most of the closings and the attorneys and stuff like that I have worked with.
Right. Yep. And just to clarify, neither myself nor you are attorneys, so
That is
obviously
correct. This is not legal advice. This is education only.
Exactly.
As my friend John Heyer said, if this was accounting advice, which I can give, okay, if I was giving you accounting advice, you would be paying me, and you're not. So this is education only.
Yeah. So because a lot of people get hung up on the equitable interest question, at least the investors, they're confused. They're confused about how is a lease and option when we sell on a lease and option, how is that different from a contract for deed, for example?
Right.
you want to speak to that for one?
Yeah,
For one
and
minute?
in fact, if you are buying sub 2, if you are buying on a contract for deed, all of those methods down to in the hierarchy down to lease and option, all of those methods convey what we call equitable interest, which means you have ownership, right? It might not be a legal title that you have, but you have ownership rights to that property. And one of the big deals when this first started going around as to whether you have equitable interest or not really boiled down to how can I market the property? Because essentially, if you don't have equitable interest in a property, you are not entitled to market that property. Right.
Yeah.
So that's why we were a lot worried about that. The other reason we were concerned about equitable interest is what would happen when we go to court. Okay.
Right.
Meaning, does that tenant optionee, since we're talking about lease and option deal, does that tenant or does your buyer, if we're talking about sub 2 deals, contracts for deed, do they have any ownership rights in that property? And with a lease and option deal, your end buyer, okay, does not have any ownership rights until they actually exercise that option.
Right.
So as long as they're holding the option, they have no ownership rights to that property.
So that, yeah, and that could have implications for if you ever have to go to court, how the ruling could go, and
So
then
one
like
way
you
or the
said,
other.
yep,
Right.
and then for
Right.
tax purposes as well, there's some pretty significant implications as well if it gets reclassified as a sale and not actually. So what about lease purchases where I've seen it's a purchase agreement, not an option agreement, but the purchase agreement kind of looks like an option agreement, and that's been confusing to me. Where I've seen a larger down payment, for example, 10% on a lease purchase, I would assume that this is conveying equitable interest, that this is like an installment sale, but it's
Yes,
not.
in my opinion, it does. All right. And here's another difference too. The difference between a lease and option and a lease and purchase. Okay. I've seen purchase and sale agreements that say I'm renting the property, but at the end of the lease, I'm going to buy the property for X amount of dollars, blah, blah, blah. Right. The major difference between the two is if you have a lease and purchase agreement, a lease and purchase agreement is binding. In other words, there is no right to back out of that deal. You have agreed to buy that property. Now, you know as well as I, if at the end of that lease you decide you don't want to buy that property, nobody's going to make you buy that property. They are not going to hold a gun to your head and say, hey, dude, you said you were going to buy it. Now you got to buy it. You can choose not to buy it, but there are ramifications for being in breach of a contract. And that's what would happen. You would be in breach of that contract if you chose not to buy the property. With a true lease and option deal, okay, you as the buyer or your tenant optionee, they have the right to buy, but not the obligation to buy. So if they decided to walk away and say, dude, I've decided I'm not going to buy this property, there's nothing you can do about it. You have no recourse. So that's the difference, as I understand it, between a lease and option and a lease purchase agreement.
Okay. Well, why would an investor want to do a lease and purchase over a lease and option
They wouldn't.
in the first place?
The investor would not want to.
Okay.
Okay. And I think what you may be getting to is I referred to an executive lease purchase type thing, right? That's just something that we call it. If you read the contract, it is still an option agreement to buy. So even though we call a specific program, and I have one, I mean, back when I was doing lease option deals, in a lot of cases, if it was a high-end property, especially, how many attorneys want to do a rent to own? That just doesn't sound right to them. But I know, I've actually had a few attorneys who'd be quite willing to enter into an executive lease purchase program type thing. So it's just what we call it. It's not what the contract actually says. Okay. Now here's
So
what
you might call it.
I might
You
call
could
it a lease
call it.
purchase, but it's really a lease option.
Gotcha. Okay.
Right. It all
Gotcha.
depends on what the contract says. And as far as somebody says, well, isn't that misleading the buyer. No, it's not, because he knows the difference. He doesn't care really what we call it. He knows what his contract says. So he might refer to it as a lease purchase, but he knows that he can walk away if he wants to, because it's truly a lease option deal. So that's why you, as the investor part, need to know the differences in types of actual contracts, because you don't want to go in and have your client or your end buyer tied up on a lease purchase when that's not what was really intended on the paperwork. What a lot of people don't realize, you can take a standard purchase and sale agreement, one from a realtor, and you can turn that into a lease option by using an addendum to the contract that lays out and says, this is a lease with the right to option, or this is a lease with an option, right? So it's what the contract says, not what they are necessarily calling that contract. And I get a lot of times people say, that's misleading. That's misleading. Not as long as you're, as the parties to the contract understand, and as long as what the contract itself says, because everybody who is part of that contract, they are or should be obligated to review that contract with their, their counsel or whatever you want to call them. Say, make sure everybody knows what the contracts say and that they all agree, etc.
Right. So an investor might decide to call their program, what they're offering, like a lease purchase or an executive lease and option. But really the paperwork just might simply be a lease and an option to buy. So
Correct.
you could call it that as well. But most people, when they hear renters, when they hear a lease and option, in my experience, they don't necessarily know what that is. They know what rent to own is, kind of. I mean, that's an extremely vague term.
That's the operative word, kind of. Good Southern word. It's kind of, sort of. It's kind of, sort of this.
Yeah, the appeal, like the strategy for the investor is to name it something that's more appealing. I think I like the lease purchase sound because that, somebody who really does want to own the property, has aspirations for home ownership. That
like the
sounds,
sound of a purchase.
Yes.
Period.
When in reality, there's no commitment to purchasing in that option. It's just they'll still have that option. And I wanted to get to this from the investor's perspective. There's nothing on paper that shows that we were intending to sell this property out from the get-go. And so, because what I'm getting at is the dealer investor paradigm. Because if you're buying a bunch of sub twos and then selling them all on a lease, an actual purchase, like an actual these purchase and sale agreement with a tenant, right? So it's an actual lease purchase where they're going to buy it from you after 12 months or whatever. That still can look like you're just dealing. You're just a dealer of properties, and you're not actually intending to hold them for investment purposes. If that's 100% your business, so then
Correct.
You'd have a hard time defending yourself as an investor. So can you speak once again, just speak on that topic for a minute?
Sure. So the difference between dealer property, right, and investment property, one you buy and hold, supposedly, okay, the other you buy and flip and sell. So we all agree that flippers, wholesalers, they are dealers, okay? So you don't want it to look like you're a dealer, because a dealer buys properties with the intent to sell them. And so if you took every single property and you put it on a lease purchase, okay, it could look like, hey, you just intended to buy the property and sell it and turn it. You had no idea to hold that property, right?
Yeah.
What I like to do, and this is one of the strategies that we have to make sure that Internal Revenue Service could not come back and call you a dealer, is if you buy a property with the intent to hold it, okay, and then you lease it, but your lessee thought that they would like to buy it down the road and they have the option to buy it, okay, it's still a rental property, which classifies as an investment property. So it could not be come back later on and reclassified as a sale, as a flipper, as a wholesaler. type thing.
Right. Yep. And so what we're talking about is really just mitigating risk on the tax front. So
Right.
if our
And
business
yeah,
model
and
is
it's a good tax strategy. Now, let's say that was your business model. You buy, you'd lease, and with the option to buy, and you do it for a year, and that's all you did. They may still be able to come back and say, well, this is your business model. You're selling every one of these. You're just doing a lease first. Okay. That would mitigate the risk somewhat. But what would mitigate the risk more is if you had an operating agreement that said you were an investor and you bought properties to hold for investment. Okay. But then you had a reason for selling the property. And there are like about 14 reasons, what I'm getting to in that Internal Revenue Service will let you buy a property and never even rent it out, just sell it almost like immediately, that you get away with. But if you do a lease on your property with the option to buy, then you are following the paperwork and following up and setting yourself up to be an investor and not a dealer. So it makes it a lot easier for you to treat this as investment property when you sell it. And the big difference there is that if you were a dealer, all of that profit would be subject to self-employment tax in addition to ordinary income tax. If you do it as an investor, then the gain is only subject to capital gains. And of course, if it's a short-term capital gain, it's subject to ordinary income tax rates. If it's a long-term capital gain, which means you've held the property for more than a year, and that includes the rental period, right? So if you rent it for a year and then sell it, it's going to be a long-term capital gain, and that's going to be subject based on what your total capital gains rates are, which can be 0%, 15%, or 20%, right? Depending on what your adjusted gross income is for the year.
Yes. I mean, this is such a great topic. I know it's in depth. And when I first learned about all of this, I was taken aback. Like, why didn't anybody talk about this or tell me about this? Because it does have really large ramifications for your business once you start to do, more than a handful of deals. And then you're looking at you're talking with your tax accountant and they're, telling you what you're going to be owing and all that kind of thing. So that's really good, really great stuff. And I guess, yeah, it's like if you were just doing a lease purchase every single time, collecting 10% down, this looks like you're just turning around and seller financing every
Flipping
single thing.
properties. Yeah.
Yep, flipping properties. Whereas I really like myself having the lease and option tool in my tool belt here because it can really feel like you're selling it on seller financing. Just it can feel that way from the sense of you're so hands off with your optionee, the person living in the property. They're doing the maintenance and the repairs and whatnot. Even though we're still landlords, right? Technically, it can still have that feel. But like you said, you get 12 months of you can see the payment history. Then you have long-term capital gains once if you do transition to an installment sale after that, rather than short-term. We're showing clearly intent as investors, which is great. And there's a lot of benefits to the model, and you can always transition to seller finance after the option period, right?
Right. Yeah. In fact, when they get ready to exercise their option, you can go right to seller finance right then. Right? You don't have to wait. You can offer them seller financing as part of the exercise of the option. What I don't do is guarantee them that, right? You don't want to guarantee your tenant optionee that you're going to finance their property. You can mention it maybe, right? And say, oh, by the way, when you get ready to exercise your option, depending on how you have made payments and stuff like that, I may be able to carry some of the financing for you. You can say that, right? But I don't put any of that in writing.
Yeah, and
because if you do, okay, if you say when you get ready to exercise your option, I will do seller financing, you're obligated to do that seller financing when they get ready to exercise their option. You have committed yourself to doing seller financing.
Yes, great point. Let me ask a follow-up to that. What if you stated that it was dependent or contingent on their ability to qualify with an RMLO, for example?
Yes, if you put a financing contingency in there, you might be able to do that. However, I'm a little leery about putting a financing contingency on there because when they get ready to exercise their option, if you've given them a financing contingency in there, then whether or not they qualify, I mean, it sets up a lot of ramifications as to, what might happen as far as that financing contingency is concerned. Because usually in an option, a lot of times you will see that the option does not depend on a financing contingency. So, you can't have it both ways. You've either got to say, all right, it's got to be a financing contingency in there, or there's not going to be a financing contingency in there, which basically means, and I guess with an option, it wouldn't make a lot of difference because an option, they can either exercise their option or not exercise their option. They can walk away from it. So a financing contingency really wouldn't make a lot of difference. It would make a difference if it's a purchase agreement, because a financing contingency basically in a purchase agreement says that if I can't get the financing, I don't have to buy. I'm not obligated in the purchase agreement.
Right. Yeah, I guess where I'm going to with all this is when it comes to, selling your product to somebody and trying to get as high of an option fee as you can. On some deals, you need a larger option fee just to make them viable.
Gotcha.
It's a lot easier to make that sell, to make the pitch to your prospective tenant optionee, like, hey, if you can qualify with my underwriter,
I'll do the financing.
and
Yeah.
then and if you're keeping the terms of you're making the payments on time, and the underwriter RMLO is going to figure that out because they're going to ask for rental history. So then then we'd be willing to do this.
Okay.
We're not going to put this down on paper, but
Gotcha.
this is our intention. I'm just communicating this with you
Yeah,
verbally.
I see. And I agree with that. You make your seller financing contingent on whether they would qualify or not.
Right. So I guess my point is, if we're trying to get a larger 5%, maybe we stretch it up to 6 or 7% option fee because the deal just is tight and we need that to recoup capital. Is it okay to offer that verbally? And I would do it just contingent.
It is any of any of the negotiation between you and your potential buyer is just that, negotiation. And the nice part about it is as we all know, you can negotiate anything you want to. So yeah, if that will get you the higher fee,
okay,
whatever.
Right.
But how it is spelled out, you have to make it very clear that what they're getting is the right to buy the property, right? They're not getting any interest in the property, right? And you need to make it very clear that, dude, if you walk away, you ain't getting none of your money back. So that's why you have to weigh risk again, because don't forget, I would dare say that the higher the option is, or higher the option fee is, if the deal goes south, the higher the option fee is, the more likely your butt will be hauled into court for them to try to get their money back.
So your risk goes up in terms of like legal
I
liability.
think so. I think your risk goes up with the amount that your tenant or that your optionee puts down. Because look at it this way, if they put down $5,000, they would be much more willing to walk away from $5,000 than they would be willing to walk away from $15,000.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that absolutely makes sense.
It's all about business. It's a business decision. Right. And I totally know what you mean by recouping some of that upfront capital. Because remember, let's say that you have to you need to make some payments, or there might be some repairs that you need to do or something like that. You might need a higher option fee in order to be able to recoup some of your upfront costs.
Exactly. And that's kind of the, business model for a lot of folks. They're trying to be net zero at the end of the day.
Absolutely. That's my thing. As well-known saying, the house has to pay for itself. So I don't want to be coming out any money that I'm not going to recoup from my, optionee. I want all my money back.
Right.
I don't want any of it to be hanging out there more than 60 days.
Right. And you might bring in a private lender on a deal where maybe there's enough cash flow spread, right, to bring them in, right?
Yep.
So that if you are going to be net like negative on the front end after you place, then your lender can cover bridge the gap, and you would
Right. And
and you
and
could
I
pay
would
them.
use private money more more if I was taking ownership of the property than if I was doing a lease and option on it.
Yeah.
Rarely have I ever bought private money into a lease and option deal.
Right. I could see that for sure.
Yeah.
That makes total sense. Have you done lease and options remotely, like virtually, not just in your
Absolutely.
backyard?
Sure.
How has
Sure.
that worked out?
Uh, it works out fine. It's just like any other deal.
Hmm.
Okay. In fact, if you can do a sub 2 deal remotely, or if you can do a contract for deed remotely, you can definitely do a lease and option deal remotely.
Yeah, and well,
There's
I'm
not that much difference.
I know, and that's what I was getting to about the feel of it from the investor's perspective. It can feel like you're holding a note, or you're holding a contract for a deed. But I guess where I'm going with it is for folks who are like note investors, or they're just seller financing, they're wrapping. Doing that remotely seems like a lot less risky than actually being a landlord remotely. If you're out of state, hundreds of miles away, and you're at,
Absolutely. And I think that it boils down to um, the idea that you have to look at the tenant optionee and gauge them as buyers and not tenants, basically. Okay. Because buyers tend to take better care of the property, they don't let it get run down, et cetera, right? And that's
Mhm.
why a lot of people get to the rent to own thing. They say, oh, we don't want to do rent to own because they consider their tenants lower class or something like that. That they would do damage to the property and not think about it, like whereas somebody who's buying it is not. Which is why I always try to stress that my tenant optionees are buyers in training. Okay. I let them know up front, say, dude, okay, you would not call Bank of America in the middle of the night to tell them your toilet is leaking. I don't expect you to do that to me either. So you want them to have have, like you said, a sense of ownership. You want them to feel like they are buying the property. Okay. Which is something that you and I have been talking about, in the last few days through some conversation about whether you give credits or not. All right. One of the advantages of saying that you're doing rent credits is that they feel like some of the money they are giving you every month is going to buy the property and not wasting their rent, if you know what I mean. So you want to do everything like you're onboarding. When you're talking with your tenant buyer, you need to be stressing the fact that you're treating them as owners. They need to take pride in the ownership. This is a property that they are intending to buy at the end of their
Mhm.
lease, and so they should treat it
Mhm.
that way. And shouldn't be planning on letting the property get run down and stuff like that, because this is something that they're going to own. They're going to get a piece of this, right? They're going to buy the property from you at the end. So you want to stress that ownership. And I think if you do a good job with your tenant buyer screening, that you will get good people in the property. At least that's been my experience.
That's great. No, that's fantastic. Yeah.
So
Real
that's why I
quick.
really don't. That's why I really don't mind doing it remotely if I have to.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
again, you heard me talk about this before. Remote to me means that I can drive there within 5.5, 6 hours. Okay, because for me that's like a cakewalk, and I guess I got used to it from where I live to where I grew up and my family is and stuff like that. It's about a
Mhm.
6 hour drive, right? So nicely, when I look at that radius of 6 hour drive from where I am located, it puts me in some very good market. So that's why I don't mind, because even though it's a lease agreement and an option agreement, if I had to get there to take care of something important, I rarely have run into that. And this is more for my master lease option type deals. If I had to be there, I could leave in the morning, get there, you know, midday, lunch, before lunch or something, get my business taken care of, leave at a couple of, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, still get back in evening, right? So it's a simple drive back and forth.
Yeah, which makes sense with where you're at, and kind of where I'm at too. There's a few places I can get to in that period of time.
Right.
Some folks are investing from, like Canada or like East Coast places that
Hey, good
are,
job. Right. Just like,
yeah,
I've got clients in Texas and they say, dude, I can't even get out of the state in in 5 hours. Right.
which is why I asked the question. I like your answers. Basically, you treat your lease optionees like you treat them like buyers, or at least you vet them like buyers. You talk to them like they're going to
I
be
vet
buyers.
them as a buyer. And I look at it this way. If I'm doing a lease with an option, okay, if I would not do a contract for deed with this person, I'm not going to
Right.
do a lease and option with this person.
Mm,
That's how I vet them. Because here's the thing. If they decide to option their property, I want to be able to do the seller financing because it gives me a greater rate of return on my property. Right. So I would like to do the seller financing. The only advantage that a lease gives you is you can kind of determine how they're going to be paying, because let's face it, things happen and it doesn't make any difference how well you vet. There's always the possibility that they may not make their payments on time. Right.
correct.
We hope that that's not the case, but if let's say we did a contract for deed with them, they didn't make their payments on time, we ended up taking the property back, we'd have to foreclose on it. Okay.
Right.
If they're a lease with an option, okay, we just have to not finance the option. We can tell them, say, hey, yeah, you can exercise your option. You're going to have to go out and get your own financing. And if you can qualify, that'll pay me off. And then, dude, you're somebody else's problem, not Bill's problem.
Right. Totally. Yeah. And on contract for deed in some states, I know that you can still evict up to a certain point of their building equity if they haven't built
Oh yeah,
that. I know
there's a
it
few.
varies,
Yeah,
varies by state.
there's a few states that say if they've only paid for up to 24 months, you can evict the first 24 months. Anything past 24 months, you have to foreclose. There are some states that you have to foreclose from the get-go. Doesn't make any difference. Okay,
Mm,
you don't have any leeway. Then there are other states that treat contracts for deed basically like a glorified lease,
yeah.
and you can evict. Period. It's called forfeiture, right? And
Yeah.
what happens is that you just forfeit. Now, quite honestly, I will tell you, my contract for deed basically says that if you don't pay, okay, then you are giving me the property back, and everything you paid me converts over to rent, and it's treated as though you paid me rent the whole time. I know that that's not going to fly in every state, but that's how my contract reads. And my contract reads that way for the potential is if the guy chooses to live by the contract and he doesn't pay, he's going to give me the property back, right?
Right.
And there's not going to be an issue. If he decides to take it to court, I might lose in court. And I know I might lose in court because my contract goes against state rules and regs. Okay. But I have the option to negotiate that with my tenant optionee. And if the judge rules against and says, nope, you got to foreclose instead, then that's what I would have to do.
Yeah. 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 It's important to know your state's laws wherever you're operating, so that when you're doing a contract for deed or like a wraparound, then you definitely know what you're getting into in terms of time.
And
And
my contracts are always written in my favor, but I go into it knowing that, hey, I might lose this if it ever went to court.
right. Right. Yeah. Just because, yeah, you're going to write it one way, knowing that it may not be entirely enforceable, but that sets the tone for the relationship with the tenant buyer or the buyer in
Absolutely.
that certain. Yeah, that's good.
Again, guys, educational purposes, not legal advice.
Absolutely. Yeah, we don't play attorneys on TV either. So, um, okay. Well, I think this is very enlightening conversation. I have one lingering question. If I don't, this is kind of going back to the equitable interest thing before we wrap up. But
Sure.
I do have a question about um the period of time that you would set a lease, if you're giving a tenant optionee, which I've called them tenant buyers in the past, but you've said, it's better to just say what it actually is tenant optionee. So that's what
Well,
I'm going with.
we always call them that. A lot of times you'll hear me say tenant buyer, okay, because they are going to be buying the property. But the
Mhm.
proper term, and there are a few people who say, "Oh no, it's not a buyer, it's an optionee because
Yeah,
they haven't exercised their option."
I
Right.
get it.
So I know where you're coming, but yeah,
Yeah.
properly a tenant optionee.
Tenant optionee, tenant buyer, same thing.
Absolutely.
So if you're giving them, say, 24 months, they have that they can exercise that option. Okay. Um, is your lease going for 24 months as well, or are you going to do a 12-month lease and renew it?
You can give them a 12-month lease with a renewal and a 24-month option. I don't like to do that. Okay. And the reason I don't like to do that is I want my option to expire when my lease does. Because a bad situation would be if at the end of 12 months, the buyer decides he doesn't want to exercise or he doesn't want to stay in the property. He's going to walk away from the property. Well, unless you tell him in some type of documentation that the option runs concurrent with the lease, you might have a new tenant in there with somebody else having the right to buy the property,
Mhm,
and I don't want
mhm.
that. Okay,
Makes
so
sense.
what I do with a tenant optionee, I always run the lease along with the option. Right. So if I've got a 12-month lease, they have an option that expires when the lease expires. So at the
Yes,
end of the 12 months, they have to either exercise the option or just walk away.
but you would never make reference in the lease document to the option document. You never make reference to the lease document in the option to purchase document. What you're saying is the length of time will be concurrent, but you're not using
Yeah, well,
language.
each one is going to have a dated period, and I just make sure that the option period and the lease period are the same. They don't have to reference each other.
Gotcha.
Okay, so
Yeah.
my option would say my option starts on this date, it ends on this date. My lease would say my lease starts on this date, it ends on this date, and those two dates would be the same. They don't have to reference each other. Now, here's the thing, and I know where you're getting at. My lease agreement, my residential lease agreement, never mentions the option. Doesn't cover the option. You don't want to give any indication in the lease that there may be an option to buy the property. Okay. The option agreement, however, will sometimes reference the lease, because I say in my option agreement that if you do not meet the terms and obligations of the lease agreement, the option is void. Okay, meaning 6 months into my lease agreement, if I have to evict them, I don't want them to have the remaining remaining months on an option. I want the option to end if the lease ends. So in my option agreement, I will say, if you don't follow the rules and regs, and if the residential lease agreement attached to this property is not complied with, it
Mhm.
ends this option. But that's the only reference I make. I don't put into my option agreement, when the rent has to be paid, and I don't put in there that they have to take over the maintenance and all that kind of stuff. That I don't put into the option agreement, but I do reference the rental agreement, saying if you do not conform with the rental agreement, then the option is void.
And and can you recap why do you try and keep the two documents as separate as possible?
Because if I have to evict this person, I don't want them to be able to go in and waive an option in front of a judge and say, "Oh, judge, I've got an option. I'm buying this property. Look here, I've got an option on this property. I should be able to get all my money back. You can't evict me until my option is over." I've actually seen that used as an excuse before. And unfortunately, guess what happened? The judge agreed and said,
Mm.
look, if you've got an option to buy this property, then you ought to be allowed to stay in the property until your option to buy the property is over with. Dumb reasoning on the judge, because it specifically said that the option was void if the rental agreement was not concerned, right?
Mhm.
Then the judge, I think, ruled incorrectly in this situation. But hey, I didn't make the law. He kind of did it, right? But I don't want him to be able to, I want to be able to go to the court and present a residential lease and say, this guy, this person is in violation of the lease agreement. I need to be able to evict him. And
Mm.
so I don't want an option to be brought up, not by me anyway, in a court. So
Wow.
that's why my lease does not talk about the option.
Oh, that's an incredible story about the judge allowing the tenant to stay in the property until that option period expires.
Yeah,
I mean, that's
it was kind of interesting because
scary.
basically what he did was say, hey, you've got a judgment for the rent that this tenant didn't pay, but I'm not kicking him out of the property because he has the right to buy it. It was a really, really weird ruling. And I, to this day, don't know how that happened. Fortunately, it was not me or one of my clients. It was just like somebody brought this to me, and I looked at the case and I said, wow, that is like a really strange ruling on the part of that judge. And I was not in the court, so I don't know what all transpired, but it's really kind of interesting where he said, okay, the guy's not paying rent. You get a judgment against him for the rent, but I'm not
Mhm.
kicking him out because he has the right to buy the property. And I think he was going with the theory that if you put another tenant in there, what's going to happen to that tenant in 6 months? You can't even give another tenant a 1-year lease because somebody else has the right to buy the property, which I didn't think was relevant. But
Mm.
like I
Do you
said,
think
we're not attorneys.
correct? Do you think that well, that kind of situation kind of relates to a question I had and that we've been talking about applying like if you're going to have a part of the payment, a part of the rent. Now I know that it might not actually be considered rent, but a part of their monthly payment to you is going to go apply toward an option, toward the option fee. So let's say they bring a certain amount um, up front, but then they're paying some monthly to get up to a certain percentage. It's called 5%. So they bring 3%, but then they're bringing $200 a month extra, for example, until they get up to 5%. Then at that point, they have the option to buy. Could if you structured something like that, then you could avoid that whole judge situation because they wouldn't even have the option until they actually got up to that 5% or whatever the number was, right?
And yeah, and here is the problem with that. If in your rent agreement you go with an option and there's monthly payments, and part of that monthly payment goes to the option, giving them the right to purchase, there is some validity to the statement that that could be interpreted as a part of a purchase deal because some of the amount is going to the purchase of the property. Okay. And I told you I was going to look for a way to see if there was a way around that, right? So what I'm thinking you were saying doing, let's say that the option fee was $10,000 and they paid you $5,000, so they still owe you $5,000, and you're saying, okay, I'm going to let you spread the option fee, the other $5,000 out over the life of the rental agreement, and when you pay me, you're paying me part for the option agreement and part for the rent. Well, that ties the option agreement to the rent agreement. Okay. And like, I don't want to do that. So what I would do if I was allowing them to do that, I would have a $5,000 note for the option payment.
Okay.
And then I would have the rent amount, and I would make them make 2 different payments. Or if they made one payment, okay, and I would allow one payment, but the payment would not be in the rent amount. So let's say that it ended up they were having to pay $200 a month for the option note and $500 a month for rent. my rental agreement would only mention the $500. It would not mention the other amount that they have to pay. Okay, that would be part of a note payment. But if they wanted to give me one check, I would take that. I would just split it in my financing documents, but I would not have that amount included in as part of the rent, if that makes sense.
Right.
In other words, I
Yep.
would not bump my rent up by $300 and make it $800 a month to cover that portion that goes to the option fee. Okay.
Area. Yeah.
Right. Now, the other thing that we used to do, which is totally allowable, okay, you could charge them $800 a month for rent. And you could tell them, and it could be in the rental agreement that says if they are consistently paying when they get ready to buy the property, okay, $300 of that $800, $300 of it could be applied to the purchase price. So you say, I allow it to be applied to the purchase price, not to the option. It goes to reduce the purchase price. So it would actually be shown on a HUD statement as a seller concession, right? Where you actually decrease
That's
the
interesting.
purchase price. So you can do that. And and what happens for that, you know, and a lot of people worried about DTI and stuff like that if they're trying to do a refinance or if they're trying to finance the property and things like that. So what lenders actually will do is they will look at the fair market value of the lease, okay, the fair market value of the rent, and any amount that is considered in excess of fair market rent, they allow to be applied to a loan and stuff like that when you're trying to do refinancing and stuff. So they allow for rent credits.
Interesting. I have more questions on that topic. I think we can go down that.
Well, that's a rabbit hole that we could spend like an hour talking about how to do rent credits and whether you should or not. And excuse me, I got something in my throat. Rent credits were really never an issue until Dodd-Frank.
Okay.
Right, because Dodd-Frank is the one that talks about loan terms and how much can be applied and what's considered a sale and what's not considered a sale, and do you need a RMLO, and you know, all of this kind of stuff. And so Dodd-Frank has this thing about anytime you are financing the property over a period of time, it's considered a loan and considered financing, and Dodd-Frank rules apply. Right. So the issue back then was, hey, if I've got somebody paying me, okay, $300 a month that goes to the purchase price, is that considered financing under Dodd-Frank? And do we have to have this lease agreement looked at by an underwriter type thing? So it was never an issue before then about how we can treat rent credits. Then Dodd-Frank brought all that mess up, and
interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. I guess I'm still unclear as to why not include it in the purchase option paperwork, that a certain amount will be going toward the purchase price of the house.
When you say in the purchase contract, what type of contract are you talking about? The option contract?
The option.
You
I
can.
meant the option contract.
Yeah, in the option contract, you can say $300 per month of the rent will be applied to the purchase price. You can absolutely say that in the option agreement, but it's applying rent. You're not splitting and calling $300 a month an option fee. You're calling $300 a month of rent being applied to the purchase price. So it's two different things.
Right. Or you could have, and correct me if I'm wrong, you could have $300 of the rent applied to the purchase option, because the purchase option applies to the price anyway.
Yeah, it does. But my question would be, why do that? It's either one or the other, right?
Right.
Because if you're saying you want it applied to the purchase, then you're paying purchase option. You're not paying rent. You can't call it both. If you said in your option agreement, $300 of the rent is going to the option fee, then you're calling part of the rent that you're paying option fee, and it's not. So you can always say that $300 of the rent gets applied to the purchase price, okay? But then that lets you have all the rent as the $800. If you said $300 applies to the purchase price, then $300 of that $800 is actually per option, not rent. So it confuses the two as to how that $800 is classified.
Ah, that's interesting. That's very interesting. I'm going to have to dwell on that. I think that might be the solution to that question I had. That's very interesting. Yeah. Okay.
And that's
Yeah.
that's the big deal, right? Because $800 of rent a month is totally different than $500 of rent a month and $300 of option fee, right?
Correct.
Right. And the big difference is your income, because you know as well as I, rent income is taxable, option fee income is not taxable. Because if the option is exercised, all of that monies that you received as part of the option just rolls over into the sales price of the property, and that's not income to you. Okay. And and the difference is, if the option expires and they walk away from it, if it's a non-refundable option, all of a sudden you've got all that money and it's recognized as income in the year that the option expires. Okay, so that's going to be ordinary income, but the difference is it's ordinary income, period. It's not ordinary rent income. Right. So there's a difference. There's a difference between rent income and option income, option fee income.
Wow, that's getting deep. I like that. And so, but to clarify on one topic real quick, is that you would have the monthly amount only apply when they go to exercise their option? You would have it only apply
What would
end of
happen?
the option
What
period.
what happens? All right. So what happens with that extra $300 that you have treated as rent? Okay. Exercise the option, you say that you're going to let them count $300 that rent against the purchase price. It goes on a line called seller concession. Okay, so on a HUD, it would go as a seller concession, and it would decrease the purchase price. It would be subtracted from the purchase price and be less cash that the buyer would have to bring to the property or bring to the table.
Okay, yeah, super interesting. Well, you're a wealth of information and creativity when it comes to structuring these things. So I would encourage anybody who's got questions about lease and options or creative finance, obviously reach out to you, and not just for that, but for the tax strategy as well. If you didn't know, Bill's a master tax strategist when it comes to real estate, especially creative finance. So I think we'll wrap this up. This has been a really good conversation. And Bill, I want to thank you again for joining. And how do people get a hold of you if they want to reach out?
Okay, they can find me on Facebook, of course, right? And my messenger is set that I get messages from anybody who messages me, so they can shoot me a message on Facebook, or they can reach out to me and send me an email at bill@billwalston.com.
Very good. Yep. And I would agree. Yeah, I think Facebook is you're very keen to respond on Facebook Messenger. So that's not always the case with more high profile real estate public figures.
And a lot of times that's the fastest way to get up with me. But if you do, okay, at least in the message, don't start it off by saying hi or hey, because I don't respond to those. You would at least need to say, hey, I saw you on the interview with Hans, and I have a question. That would ensure that I would get back to you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Well, this is great, Bill. I learned a ton, and thanks again for joining. I hope we can do another one on a different topic another time. I got more questions.
Let me know when.
All right. Cheers.